I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw the construction equipment parked in my backyard. The yellow excavator sat there like some kind of mechanical vulture, its arm extended over what used to be the entrance to my root cellar. Dirt was everywhere, and standing beside it with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile plastered across her face was Patricia Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. My name is Zachary Oakes, and I had just inherited this property in rural Pennsylvania from my grandfather 6 months ago. The house itself was beautiful, a 1920s farmhouse that sat on 2 acres of land just outside of Lancaster. But the real treasure was the root cellar, a stone structure built into the hillside behind the house that my great-great-grandfather had constructed with his own hands back in 1887. The thing was a masterpiece of old-world craftsmanship, with hand-cut limestone walls and an arched ceiling that had kept vegetables fresh through countless winters. I jumped out of my truck and ran toward Patricia, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell's going on here?" She turned to me with that condescending look I had come to despise over the past few months. "Mr. Oakes, we sent you 3 notices about this structure. It violates Code Section 14.7 of the HOA bylaws. Underground structures must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, and this one never was." "That structure has been there for over 100 years, I shouted, looking past her at the damage. The excavator had already torn off the wooden door and part of the stone entrance. Chunks of limestone lay scattered across my lawn. "My great-great-grandfather built that." "That's not our concern," Patricia said, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "The HOA has standards to maintain. When you purchased this property, you agreed to abide by our rules. This cellar is an eyesore and a liability. What if someone fell into it? It has a door. It's been perfectly safe for over a century." My hands were shaking with rage. "You can't just demolish a structure on my property without my permission. That's destruction of private property." Patricia pulled out a stack of papers from her expensive leather bag. "Actually, according to Section 31.2 of your HOA agreement, if a homeowner fails to respond to 3 written notices about a violation, the HOA has the authority to remedy the situation and bill the homeowner for the costs. You received your first notice 90 days ago." I had received notices, sure, but they were always about stupid things. My grass being a 1/4 inch too tall, my mailbox being the wrong shade of black, a garden gnome my girlfriend had placed by the front door being in violation of the decoration policy. I'd assumed the root cellar notice was just another one of Patricia's power trips, something I could fight through the proper channels. I never imagined she would actually destroy it. "Stop the demolition right now," I demanded. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Patricia said smugly. "Everything we're doing is perfectly legal. I have the paperwork right here. You'll also be receiving a bill for $8,000 to cover the demolition costs and restoration of the landscaping." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, but as Patricia had predicted, when the officer arrived 20 minutes later, he looked over the paperwork and told me there was nothing he could do. The HOA had followed their procedures, and I had signed the agreement when I purchased the property. If I wanted to fight it, I would need to do so in civil court. By the time the officer left, the excavator had torn away most of the entrance structure. I stood there, helpless, watching generations of my family's history being destroyed. The operator, a tired-looking man in his 50s who clearly didn't want to be there, kept glancing at me apologetically between scoops of earth and stone. When my girlfriend Olivia Edwards arrived home from work that evening, she found me sitting on the back porch, staring at the wreckage. The root cellar entrance was completely gone, replaced by a pile of rubble and a gaping hole in the hillside. "Oh my God, Zach," she said, sitting down beside me and taking my hand. "I can't believe they actually did it." "I should have taken it more seriously," I said. "I should have hired a lawyer the moment I got the first notice." "How were you supposed to know they would go this far?" Olivia asked. She was trying to be supportive, but I could hear the frustration in her voice. "We had sunk our savings into buying this house, and now we were facing an $8,000 bill for demolition we never wanted." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my grandfather, about the stories he used to tell me about that root cellar, how his grandmother would store apples and potatoes down there, how the temperature stayed perfect year-round, how the stone walls had been quarried from a site just 3 miles away. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a piece of history, a connection to my family's past. The next morning, I called every lawyer in Lancaster County. Most of them told me the same thing. HOAs in Pennsylvania have broad authority, and fighting them is expensive and time-consuming. One lawyer quoted me $15,000 just to start the case, with no guarantee of success. I didn't have that kind of money, not after buying the house. But then I got a call back from a paralegal at one of the firms I had contacted. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she had an interesting suggestion. "Mr. Oakes, I'm not supposed to give legal advice, but I was doing some research after you called. Have you contacted the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission? If your root cellar is as old as you say it is, and if it has historical significance, there might be protections in place that supersede your HOA agreement." I sat up straight. "What kind of protections?" "Pennsylvania has pretty strict historic preservation laws," Sarah explained. "If a structure is over 50 years old and has architectural or historical significance, it can be designated as a historic landmark. Once that happens, it can't be demolished or significantly altered without approval from the state. Your HOA might have just destroyed a protected structure without realizing it." After I hung up, I immediately started searching through my grandfather's papers. He had been meticulous about documenting the family history, and I knew he had information about the root cellar somewhere. It took me 3 hours of digging through boxes in the attic, but I finally found what I was looking for: a leather-bound journal that belonged to my great-great-grandfather, Herman Oakes. The journal was filled with entries about the construction of the root cellar. Herman had documented everything, from where he quarried the stone to the techniques he used to create the arched ceiling. He had even included hand-drawn diagrams and measurements. As I read through the entries, I realized this wasn't just any root cellar. Herman had been a stonemason by trade, and he had used construction techniques that were rare even in the 1880s. The cellar was essentially a small-scale version of European wine cellars, with sophisticated ventilation and drainage systems built into the design. I took photographs of every page and sent them to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, along with a detailed letter explaining what had happened. Then I waited. 3 days later, I got a call from a woman named Dr. Rebecca Thornton, who identified herself as a field historian with the PHMC. "Mr. Oakes, I've reviewed the documentation you sent, and I have to say, I'm very concerned about what happened to your root cellar," she said. "Based on the information you provided, this structure should have been registered with our office years ago. It represents a significant example of 19th century rural architecture and immigrant craftsmanship." "Can you help me?" I asked, trying not to sound too desperate. "I'm going to come out and inspect what's left of the structure," Dr. Thornton said. "Can you meet me at your property tomorrow morning?" I took the day off work, and when Dr. Thornton arrived, I was surprised to see she had brought 2 other people with her, a structural engineer and a photographer. They spent over 2 hours examining the damaged root cellar, taking measurements and documenting everything with cameras and laser measuring devices. Dr. Thornton was in her early 60s, with short gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent decades fighting to preserve history. As she walked around the site, I could see her getting angrier and angrier. "This is vandalism," she finally said, looking at me with genuine sympathy. "I don't care what your HOA agreement says. Under the Pennsylvania History Code, specifically Section 1014, any structure over 50 years old that demonstrates significant historical or architectural value is protected from demolition. Your HOA should have contacted our office before taking any action." "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now I file an emergency protection order with the state," Dr. Thornton said. "And I'm also going to recommend that charges be filed against the HOA for destruction of a protected historical site. What's left of your root cellar is going to be designated as a state historic landmark, effective immediately. No one touches it without approval from the PHMC." I felt a surge of hope for the first time since the demolition. "Can the HOA be forced to restore it?" "That's going to be up to the courts," Dr. Thornton admitted. "But you're going to have the state of Pennsylvania on your side, which is a hell of a lot better than fighting them alone." Within 48 hours, I received official documentation from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission declaring what remained of my root cellar a protected historic landmark. The document included strict penalties for anyone who disturbed the site further, including fines of up to $50,000 and potential criminal charges. I made 3 copies of the paperwork and hand-delivered one to Patricia Whitmore's house the next evening. She answered the door in a yoga outfit, holding a glass of white wine. "Mr. Oakes, I have nothing to say to you," she began, but I cut her off by handing her the envelope. "That's fine, Patricia. You can just read this instead." She opened the envelope, and I watched the color drain from her face as she read through the official state documents. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "That pile of rocks isn't a landmark, it's a hazard. According to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it's a protected historic structure," I said calmly. "And by demolishing it without approval from the state, you and the HOA violated Section 1014 of the Pennsylvania History Code. The state is considering pressing charges for destruction of protected property." "You can't prove we knew about any historic designation," Patricia said, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. "You didn't need to know," I replied. "The law protects structures over 50 years old automatically if they meet certain criteria. And according to Dr. Rebecca Thornton from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, my root cellar definitely meets those criteria. The state is going to require full restoration at the HOA's expense." "We'll fight this," Patricia said, but she sounded uncertain. "Good luck with that," I said. "I'm sure the local news would love to hear about how the Meadowbrook Estates HOA destroyed a piece of Pennsylvania history because they thought it was ugly." I left her standing in her doorway and drove home feeling better than I had in days. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and for the first time since moving to Meadowbrook Estates, I actually attended. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a pretentious building with vaulted ceilings and a stone fireplace that probably cost more than my entire house. About 30 homeowners were in attendance, and the tension in the room was palpable. Word had spread about what happened to my root cellar, and opinions were divided. Some people thought Patricia had overstepped her authority, while others believed the HOA was just doing its job maintaining property values. Patricia called the meeting to order, flanked by the other 2 board members, Thomas Henderson, the vice president, and Margaret Sutton, the treasurer. Thomas was a retired banker who seemed to agree with everything Patricia said, while Margaret appeared to be a decent person who had gotten roped into HOA politics without fully understanding what she was signing up for. "Before we begin with regular business," Patricia said, "I want to address the situation with Mr. Oakes and his alleged historic structure." "It's not alleged," I said from my seat in the 3rd row. "The state has already issued the designation. It's official." Patricia's jaw tightened. "The HOA has consulted with our attorney, and we believe the state has overstepped its authority. The structure was on private property within an HOA community, and our bylaws take precedence." "That's not how historic preservation laws work," I countered, standing up so everyone could see me. "State law supersedes local agreements when it comes to protected structures, and your attorney should have told you that." Thomas Henderson leaned forward. "Mr. Oakes, you should have disclosed the existence of this structure when you purchased your property. The fact that you didn't is suspicious." "It wasn't hidden," I said, my voice rising. "It's been there for over 100 years. It's literally visible from my backyard. Anyone could have seen it during the property inspection before I bought the place." A woman I recognized as Karen Pritchard, who lived 3 houses down from me, raised her hand. "I think the HOA owes Zach an apology. What you did was completely out of line. You destroyed part of his property without proper justification." "We followed our procedures exactly," Patricia insisted. "Mr. Oakes was given multiple opportunities to comply voluntarily." "You could have worked with him to find a solution," Karen argued. "Instead, you went nuclear and demolished a structure that's been standing since the 1800s. Do you have any idea how bad this makes our community look?" More people started speaking up, and I realized that public opinion was turning against the HOA board. Several homeowners expressed concern about the HOA's aggressive tactics and questioned whether the board was abusing its authority. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was clear she was losing ground. Finally, Margaret Sutton spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. Patricia, I think we need to seriously consider settling this matter with Mr. Oakes. If the state is involved, we could be looking at significant legal expenses and penalties. Absolutely not, Patricia snapped. The moment we back down, we lose all authority. Every homeowner in this community will think they can ignore the rules. This isn't about rules, Margaret said, looking uncomfortable but standing her ground. This is about the law. And according to my research, the state has very clear authority in matters of historic preservation. The meeting devolved into arguments, and Patricia eventually adjourned early, claiming they needed to consult with legal counsel before making any decisions. I left feeling cautiously optimistic. The HOA was clearly worried, and internal divisions were forming. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. Dr. Thornton from the PHMC filed formal charges against the Meadowbrook Estates HOA for destruction of a protected historic site. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office got involved, and suddenly, Patricia and the HOA board were facing serious legal consequences. The local newspaper, the Lancaster Intelligencer, picked up the story, and within days it had gone viral on social media. The headline read, "HOA destroys century-old root cellar, faces state charges for demolishing historic landmark." The article included photos of my root cellar before and after the demolition, along with excerpts from Herman Oakes' journal describing the construction. My phone started ringing constantly with calls from reporters wanting interviews. News stations from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh sent camera crews. The story seemed to touch a nerve with people who were fed up with HOA overreach, and my situation became a symbol of that frustration. Patricia tried to control the narrative by giving her own interviews, claiming the HOA was the victim of regulatory overreach and that they were just trying to maintain community standards. But her statements only made things worse. In one particularly disastrous television interview, she referred to my root cellar as a glorified hole in the ground and suggested that historic preservation laws were holding back progress. The backlash was immediate and brutal. 3 weeks after the demolition, I received a call from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. The prosecutor handling the case, a sharp woman named Amanda Foster, wanted to meet with me to discuss the charges against the HOA. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Lancaster, and Amanda laid out the state's case. "Mr. Oakes, we have a strong case against the HOA," she said. "They violated Section 1014 of the Pennsylvania History Code by demolishing a protected structure without state approval. The penalties can be substantial, including fines up to $100,000 and mandatory restoration at the HOA's expense." "What about criminal charges?" I asked. "Can Patricia and the board members be held personally responsible?" Amanda nodded. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you. Under Pennsylvania law, if the destruction of a historic structure is found to be willful and malicious, individual board members can face misdemeanor charges. The penalties include fines and potentially jail time of up to 90 days. However, proving willful intent is challenging. We need to show that they knew or should have known about the historic significance of the structure and proceeded anyway." "I have proof they knew," I said, pulling out my phone. "Patricia sent me an email 2 months ago, acknowledging that the root cellar was old and had been there since the 1800s. She specifically mentioned my great-great-grandfather building it. I can forward it to you." Amanda's eyes lit up. "That could be exactly what we need. Send it to me as soon as possible." I forwarded the email right there in the coffee shop. In it, Patricia had written, "While we acknowledge that your root cellar has historical family significance and was built by your great-great-grandfather in the 1880s, this does not exempt it from current HOA regulations. The structure must be demolished to comply with community standards." "This is perfect," Amanda said, reading the email on her phone. She explicitly acknowledges the age and historical significance of the structure, then orders its demolition anyway. That demonstrates willful disregard for historic preservation laws. We can definitely pursue criminal charges now. 2 days later, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office announced that criminal charges were being filed against Patricia Whitmore, Thomas Henderson, and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA as a corporate entity. The charges included criminal mischief, willful destruction of a historic structure, and conspiracy to violate state preservation laws. The day the charges were announced, I was at work when I got a call from Olivia. She sounded excited. "Zach, you need to turn on the news. They're showing Patricia getting arrested." I pulled up a live stream on my phone and watched as 2 Pennsylvania State police officers walked Patricia out of her house in handcuffs. She was crying and protesting, saying this was all a misunderstanding. Thomas Henderson was arrested at his office, looking stunned and confused. The footage was being broadcast on every local news station. That evening, the story went national. Cable news channels picked it up as an example of HOA overreach and the importance of historic preservation. Legal experts were brought on to discuss the case, and most agreed that the HOA had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The next day, Margaret Sutton, the HOA treasurer who had expressed doubts during the meeting, held a press conference announcing her resignation from the board. She also revealed that she had been opposed to the demolition from the beginning, but had been pressured by Patricia to go along with it. "I want to apologize to Mr. Oakes and to the community," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "What happened to that root cellar was wrong, and I should have fought harder to prevent it. I hope the HOA will now do the right thing and make this situation right." Her resignation triggered a crisis within the HOA. Several other board members and committee chairs also resigned, and homeowners started calling for a complete overhaul of the HOA's leadership and bylaws. An emergency homeowners meeting was scheduled, and this time over 100 residents showed up. The clubhouse was packed, with people standing along the walls and sitting on the floor. Patricia and Thomas had both posted bail and were technically still board members, but neither of them showed up to the meeting. Karen Pritchard, my neighbor who had spoken up at the previous meeting, took charge. She had been a corporate attorney before retiring and knew how to run a meeting. "We need to address this crisis immediately," Karen said. "Our HOA has become a national embarrassment, and we're facing potentially crippling legal judgments. I propose we vote to remove the current board, install temporary leadership, and begin negotiations with Mr. Oakes and the state to resolve this matter." The vote was overwhelming. Patricia Whitmore and Thomas Henderson were removed from the board effective immediately. Karen was elected temporary president, and 2 other level-headed homeowners were chosen to serve with her. Karen approached me after the meeting. "Zach, I want to apologize on behalf of the community. What happened to you was inexcusable. The new board wants to make this right. Would you be willing to meet with us to discuss a settlement?" "I appreciate that, Karen," I said. "But at this point, it's not just up to me. The state is pressing criminal charges, and they have jurisdiction over any restoration plans." "I understand," Karen said, "but we want to cooperate fully. We'll pay for the restoration. We'll work with the State Historic Commission, whatever it takes. We just want to fix this mess." Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Karen and the new HOA board reached out to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and offered full cooperation. Dr. Thornton came back to my property with a team of specialists to assess what could be salvaged and what would need to be reconstructed. "The good news is that most of the interior structure is intact, Doctor," Thornton told me after the assessment. "The exterior entrance was damaged, but the main chamber and the stone walls are still solid. We can restore this, but it's going to take time and expertise. We'll need to bring in stonemasons who specialize in historic preservation." The HOA's insurance company initially tried to deny coverage, claiming the demolition was an intentional act not covered by their policy. But after the new board threatened to sue, and with mounting public pressure, the insurance company agreed to cover the restoration costs, which were estimated at $65,000. Karen kept me updated throughout the process. "We're also changing the HOA bylaws," she told me during one of our conversations. "No more unilateral decisions by the board. Major actions will require homeowner approval, and we're establishing an appeals process so people can contest violations before any enforcement action is taken." "That's how it should have been from the start," I said. The criminal case against Patricia and Thomas went to trial 4 months after the demolition. I testified about the root cellar's history and significance, and about Patricia's email acknowledging its age before ordering its destruction. Dr. Thornton testified as an expert witness about the structure's historical importance and the proper procedures for dealing with historic properties. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she didn't know about the state historic preservation laws and that the HOA was just trying to enforce legitimate community standards. But the prosecution presented evidence that Patricia had been warned by multiple homeowners that the demolition might be illegal, and that she had proceeded anyway because she believed the HOA's authority was absolute. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Patricia Whitmore was found guilty of willful destruction of a historic structure and criminal mischief. Thomas Henderson was convicted of conspiracy and criminal mischief. The HOA as a corporate entity was also found guilty and ordered to pay maximum fines. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. Ms. Whitmore, your actions demonstrate a flagrant disregard for both state law and basic decency. You destroyed a piece of Pennsylvania's history because it didn't fit your aesthetic preferences. Your abuse of HOA authority has caused significant harm to Mr. Oakes and to the historical record of our Commonwealth. Patricia was sentenced to 60 days in jail, with the possibility of serving 30 days if she completed 200 hours of community service with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. She was also personally fined $25,000 and banned from serving on any HOA board in Pennsylvania for 10 years. Thomas Henderson received 30 days in jail, suspended pending completion of 100 hours of community service, and payment of a $10,000 fine. The HOA was fined $100,000 and ordered to complete the restoration of my root cellar under state supervision. I was in the courtroom when the sentences were handed down, and I watched Patricia break down in tears. Part of me felt sorry for her. She had let her petty need for control destroy her life. But mostly I just felt relief that it was finally over. The restoration process took nearly 8 months. The HOA hired a specialized firm that worked exclusively on historic preservation projects. They brought in craftsmen who understood 19th century building techniques and sourced limestone from the same quarry Herman Oakes had used over a century ago. Dr. Thornton supervised the entire project, ensuring that everything was done according to historic preservation standards. She also worked with me to create an archive of Herman's journal and other family documents related to the root cellar. The Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission planned to feature the cellar in a traveling exhibit about rural American architecture. During the restoration, I learned things about the root cellar I had never known. The craftsman discovered that Herman had carved his initials and the date into one of the interior stones, HO 1887. They also found evidence of the sophisticated ventilation system he had designed, with air channels that allowed cool air to flow through the chamber naturally. Your great-great-grandfather was a master stonemason, one of the restoration workers told me. The techniques he used are rarely seen anymore. This is museum quality work. Olivia and I watched the restoration progress from our back porch. She had been my rock through everything, supporting me emotionally and helping me navigate the legal proceedings. Do you think it will feel the same when it's finished? She asked one evening as we sat watching the workers carefully lay new stones. Maybe not exactly the same, I said. But it'll still be standing. That's what matters. Patricia tried to erase my family's history, and instead, she ended up making sure it would be preserved forever. The grand reopening of the root cellar was held on a beautiful Saturday in October, almost exactly 1 year after the demolition. The Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission organized the event, and over 200 people attended. There were speeches from Dr. Thornton, from Karen Pritchard, representing the HOA, and from state representatives who had worked to strengthen Pennsylvania's historic preservation laws in response to my case. I gave a speech too, standing in front of the restored entrance with Olivia beside me. A year ago, I watched helplessly as a piece of my family's history was destroyed, I said. I felt powerless against an HOA that believed its authority was absolute. But what I learned through this experience is that there are some things more important than HOA bylaws and property values. History matters, heritage matters, and there are people and institutions willing to fight to protect those things. I paused, looking at the restored root cellar behind me. This structure has stood for over 130 years. My great-great-grandfather built it with his own hands, stone by stone. It survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless storms. And thanks to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, thanks to the new HOA leadership, and thanks to everyone who supported me through this fight, it's going to stand for another 100 years. The crowd applauded, and Dr. Thornton unveiled a bronze plaque that would be mounted beside the entrance. It read, Oakes Root Cellar, built 1887 by Herman Oakes, Master Stonemason. Designated Pennsylvania Historic Landmark, 2024. Restored, 2025. This structure represents the agricultural heritage and immigrant craftsmanship of rural Pennsylvania. After the ceremony, people toured the restored root cellar. The interior was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood visits with my grandfather. The arched stone ceiling, the cool air, the sense of history in every carefully laid stone. But now there were also informational panels telling Herman's story and explaining the construction techniques he had used. Karen Pritchard pulled me aside during the reception. Zach, I want you to know that this experience has changed our community for the better. The new HOA bylaws we adopted have become a model for other communities in Pennsylvania. We're actually getting calls from HOAs across the state asking for advice on how to reform their own governance. That's great, Karen, I said. I'm glad something positive came out of all this. There's one more thing, Karen said. The HOA board voted unanimously to waive your dues for the next 10 years. It's not much compared to what you went through, but we wanted to do something. I thanked her, though honestly the money didn't matter much to me anymore. What mattered was that my family's history had been preserved, and that Patricia's attempt to abuse her authority had been stopped. Patricia herself never apologized. She served her 30 days in jail, completed her community service, and moved out of Meadowbrook Estates before she was even released. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband divorced and that she had moved to Florida. I didn't wish her ill, but I was glad she was gone. Thomas Henderson also moved away, unable to face the community after everything that happened. The scandal had destroyed his reputation, and his adult children reportedly stopped speaking to him because of the embarrassment he had caused. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA became known as one of the most reasonable and homeowner-friendly HOAs in Pennsylvania. Karen served as president for 2 years before stepping down, and the leadership that followed maintained the reforms she had implemented. Property values actually increased after the changes, contradicting Patricia's belief that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain the community's appeal. My root cellar became something of a local tourist attraction. The Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission added it to their heritage tour routes, and a few times a year, groups of architecture students or history enthusiasts would request permission to visit. I always said yes, proud to share Herman's story and his craftsmanship with people who appreciated it. Olivia and I started using the root cellar for its original purpose, storing vegetables from the garden we planted the following spring. There was something deeply satisfying about putting potatoes and carrots into the same space where my ancestors had stored their harvests over a century ago. One evening, about 18 months after everything had settled, I was down in the root cellar organizing some storage bins when I found something I had missed before. Tucked into a tiny gap between 2 stones was a small leather pouch. Inside was a folded piece of paper, fragile with age. I carefully unfolded it and found a handwritten note in German. I took a photo and used a translation app on my phone. The message was from Herman Oakes, written to future generations. To whoever reads this, I built this cellar with my own hands, using the skills my father taught me in the old country. I came to America with nothing but those skills and the dream of building something that would last. This cellar is my gift to my children and their children. May it serve your family well. May you remember that the best things we build are not for ourselves, but for those who come after us. Herman Oakes, November 1887. I sat there in the cool darkness of the root cellar, holding my great-great-grandfather's words, and felt an overwhelming connection to him. He had built this place to last, never imagining that over a century later, his great-great-grandson would have to fight to preserve it. But his craftsmanship had endured, surviving even Patricia's attempt to destroy it. I took the note upstairs and showed it to Olivia. She read it with tears in her eyes. "You need to give this to Dr. Thornton," she said. "This should be part of the historical record." She was right, and a week later I delivered the note to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Dr. Thornton was thrilled by the discovery. They had it professionally preserved and added it to the exhibit about the root cellar, alongside photographs and excerpts from Herman's journal. The note became something of a sensation in historic preservation circles. It was featured in several academic papers about immigrant contributions to American architecture, and was even mentioned in a documentary about 19th century building techniques. As time went on, life returned to normal. I went back to my job as a civil engineer. Olivia continued her work as an elementary school teacher, and we settled into the rhythms of life in our historic farmhouse. But I never forgot the lessons I learned from my battle with the HOA. I learned that authority unchecked inevitably becomes tyranny, even in something as mundane as a homeowners association. I learned that history and heritage are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. And I learned that there are people and institutions dedicated to preserving the past, to making sure that the work of craftsmen like Herman Oakes isn't forgotten or destroyed by short-sighted bureaucrats. The root cellar stands today exactly as Herman built it, protected now not just by its own solid construction, but by the full weight of Pennsylvania law. The bronze plaque beside the entrance has already begun to develop a green patina, adding its own layer to the structure's history. Sometimes on summer evenings, Olivia and I sit on the back porch and look at the root cellar, thinking about everything it represents. It's more than just a stone structure built into a hillside. It's a testament to craftsmanship, to heritage, to the importance of remembering where we came from. It's proof that sometimes the little guy can win against seemingly overwhelming power. And it's a reminder that the best things we build are not for ourselves, but for those who come after us. Patricia Whitmore wanted to demolish my root cellar because it didn't fit her vision of a perfect suburban community. Instead, her actions ensured that it would be protected forever, celebrated as an example of American craftsmanship and immigrant achievement. The irony isn't lost on me. Years from now, when I'm gone and new owners live in this house, they'll see that bronze plaque and know the story of Herman Oakes and his beautiful root cellar. They'll know about the HOA that tried to destroy it and the state that stepped in to protect it. And maybe, just maybe, they'll appreciate the cool stone walls and arched ceiling the way I do, understanding that they're standing in a place that connects them to the past and to the generations of people who called this land home. That's Herman's legacy. Not just a root cellar, but a bridge across time, built to last, preserved against the odds, standing as a monument to the idea that some things are worth fighting for. Patricia Whitmore tried to tear that bridge down, but in the end, all she managed to do was make it stronger, more celebrated, and more protected than it ever was before. The legal battle cost me months of stress and anxiety, but it also connected me to my heritage in ways I never expected. I spent hours researching my family history, interviewing distant relatives, and piecing together the story of Herman's journey from Germany to Pennsylvania. I learned that he had been part of a wave of German stonemasons who came to America in the 1870s and 1880s, bringing with them centuries of old-world building knowledge. Dr. Thornton helped me understand just how rare and valuable Herman's work was. Most root cellars from this period were simple dugouts or rough stone structures, she explained. But your great-great-grandfather applied cathedral building techniques to a humble food storage cellar. The precision of his stonework, the engineering of the ventilation system, the way he handled the arch construction. This is the work of someone who took immense pride in his craft, no matter how small the project. That pride echoes through the years. Every time I walk down the restored stone steps into the cellar, I think about Herman selecting each stone, calculating angles, fitting pieces together like a puzzle. He never knew that his great-great-grandson would one day stand in this same space, marveling at his skill. He never imagined that the state of Pennsylvania would declare his work a protected landmark. He just built the best cellar he knew how to build, because that was who he was. The community response to the entire situation exceeded my expectations. After the initial shock wore off, neighbors I had never spoken to came by to offer their support. Some brought food, others offered to help with legal research or to testify on my behalf. The sense of outrage at what the HOA had done united people across the typical neighborhood divides. Old Mr. Patterson, who lived at the end of our street and rarely spoke to anyone, knocked on my door one evening with a bottle of whiskey and an old photograph. "This is my grandfather's barn," he said, pointing to the image. "Built in 1903. I've always worried the HOA would come after it someday, call it an eyesore or something. What you did, standing up to them, that matters to more people than you know." We sat on my porch, drinking that whiskey, two men separated by 40 years in age, but connected by our appreciation for the past and our distrust of petty bureaucracy. Mr. Patterson told me stories about the area before it was developed, when it was still active farmland, when buildings were constructed to last centuries rather than decades. The media attention eventually died down, as it always does, but the impact of the case continued to ripple outward. The Pennsylvania state legislature passed new legislation strengthening historic preservation protections and requiring HOAs to notify the State Historical and Museum Commission before demolishing any structure over 75 years old. The law was informally called the Oakes Act, and I was invited to Harrisburg for the signing ceremony. Standing in the state capitol, watching the governor sign a law that bore my name, felt surreal. I was just a guy trying to protect a root cellar, and somehow that had turned into meaningful legislative reform. Amanda Foster, the prosecutor who had handled the criminal case, told me that over a dozen other cases of HOAs destroying historic structures had been reported following the publicity around my situation. "You gave people the courage to speak up," she said, "and you showed that HOAs aren't above the law. That matters." Olivia and I got married 2 years after the root cellar was restored. We held the ceremony in our backyard, with the historic structure serving as a beautiful backdrop. Dr. Thornton attended, as did Karen Pritchard and many of our neighbors. Even some of the craftsmen who had worked on the restoration came, proud to see their work celebrated. During the reception, my uncle gave a toast that brought many people to tears. "Herman Oakes came to this country with nothing but his skills and his determination," he said. "He built something beautiful that has now lasted over 130 years. His great-great-grandson, Zach, honored that legacy by refusing to let it be destroyed. That's what family is about. That's what heritage means. Here's to Herman, to Zach, and to everything worth preserving." We spent our wedding night in the farmhouse that had been in my family for nearly a century and a half. And the next morning we went down to the root cellar together, and I showed Olivia the spot where Herman had carved his initials, now protected behind a clear preservation shield. "We should start our own journal," Olivia suggested. "Document our time here, the way Herman documented his. Leave something for whoever comes after us." It was a beautiful idea, and we started that very day. We wrote about the house, about the root cellar, about the battle with the HOA and the restoration. We included photographs and official documents, creating a record for future generations. We added to it regularly, noting the birth of our daughter 2 years later, the renovations we made to the house, the garden we expanded, the lives we built on this land that had been home to my family for so long. Our daughter, Emma, grew up knowing her great-great-great-great-grandfather's story. By the time she was 5, she could tell visitors all about Herman and his beautiful root cellar. She loved playing near the entrance, pretending she was a stonemason like her ancestor. Watching her connect with that history filled me with profound gratitude that I had fought to preserve it. The irony of the entire situation never ceased to amaze me. Patricia Whitmore's attempt to destroy the root cellar for being a code violation had resulted in it receiving the highest level of protection possible. Her desire to maintain property values had brought negative national attention to Meadowbrook Estates and caused property values to temporarily drop. Her abuse of HOA authority had led to sweeping reforms that limited HOA power, not just in our community, but across Pennsylvania. Everything she tried to accomplish backfired spectacularly, and my family's root cellar, which she had dismissed as a glorified hole in the ground, was now featured in history books, academic papers, and preservation guides as an exemplary model of 19th century rural architecture. I sometimes wondered if Patricia ever reflected on the consequences of her actions, if she ever regretted her choices. But ultimately, it didn't matter. The root cellar was safe, my family's heritage was protected, and a dangerous precedent about HOA overreach had been firmly rejected by the courts. The restoration had actually improved the root cellar in some ways. The new entrance included subtle modern safety features like better lighting and handrails that didn't detract from the historic appearance. A state-of-the-art drainage system prevented water intrusion while remaining invisible. The surrounding landscaping had been designed by a specialist in historic gardens, using plant varieties that would have been common in the 1880s. We used the space regularly, not just for storage, but as a connection to the past. On hot summer days, it provided natural air conditioning. During winter, we stored root vegetables that lasted for months in the perfect conditions Herman had engineered into his design. The cellar became a teaching tool for Emma, a way to explain history, craftsmanship, and the importance of standing up for what matters. 5 years after the restoration, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission asked permission to film a documentary about the root cellar and the legal battle that had saved it. The documentary, titled Built to Last: The Fight for America's Hidden Heritage, aired on PBS and won several awards. It featured extensive interviews with me, Dr. Thornton, Karen Pritchard, and even Amanda Foster. The documentary also included an interview with Margaret Sutton, the former HOA treasurer who had resigned in protest. She talked about the internal pressure within the HOA board, how Patricia had created an environment where dissent was discouraged and conformity was demanded. I should have fought harder, Margaret said in the interview, her regret evident. I knew what Patricia wanted to do was wrong, but I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere. Watching that excavator tear into the root cellar was one of the most shameful moments of my life. I'm glad Zach had the courage I lacked. The documentary brought renewed attention to the root cellar and to the broader issue of historic preservation. I received letters from people across the country who had similar battles with HOAs, local governments, or developers who wanted to demolish old structures in the name of progress or property values. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman in Oregon whose family's 1890s farmhouse was threatened with demolition by the county to make way for a new highway. She wrote that watching the documentary about my case had given her the courage and the roadmap to fight back. She successfully got her farmhouse designated as a historic landmark and forced the county to reroute the highway. Your great-great-grandfather's root cellar saved my family's home, she wrote. Thank you for fighting. I never set out to be an advocate or an activist. I just wanted to protect something that mattered to me. But the situation had thrust me into a larger conversation about heritage, history, and the balance between progress and preservation. I accepted speaking invitations from historic preservation societies, testified before state legislative committees considering preservation laws, and served on an advisory board for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Through it all, the root cellar remained the center of my connection to the past. I would go down there sometimes just to sit in the cool darkness, running my hands over Herman's carefully placed stones, feeling the weight of history and continuity. In a world that often felt chaotic and temporary, that solid stone structure represented something permanent, something built with intention and skill to serve generations. Olivia once asked me if I regretted buying the house, given everything we had gone through. I didn't hesitate in answering. Not for a second. This place, this history, it's who I am. Fighting for the root cellar taught me that some things are non-negotiable. Heritage matters, craftsmanship matters, standing up to bullies matters. Patricia Whitmore thought she could use her position of petty authority to erase something she found inconvenient. She learned, at great personal cost, that history is not so easily erased. The stones Herman laid in 1887 were still there, still solid, still serving their purpose. And they would be there long after Patricia, long after me, long after everyone involved in this story had passed into history ourselves. That continuity, that connection across time, is what makes historic preservation important. It's not about being stuck in the past or refusing to accept change. It's about recognizing that we are part of a larger story, that the people who came before us matter, and that we have a responsibility to preserve their legacy for those who come after. My battle with the HOA taught me that standing up for what's right is rarely easy or comfortable. There were moments during the legal proceedings when I wanted to give up, when the stress and expense seemed overwhelming. But every time I doubted myself, I would think about Herman spending his days carefully selecting and placing stones, building something meant to last. If he could put that much dedication into a root cellar, I could find the strength to protect it. The restored root cellar stands today as a monument to more than just 19th century craftsmanship. It represents the victory of heritage over bureaucracy, of substance over aesthetics, of long-term value over short-term convenience. It represents one person's refusal to be bullied, one community's decision to reform its broken governance, and one state's commitment to protecting its historic legacy. Every stone in those walls tells a story. The story of Herman Oakes, immigrant stonemason. The story of generations of my family who used and maintained the cellar. The story of Patricia Whitmore's overreach and downfall. The story of Dr. Thornton and the state historians who fought to protect it. The story of skilled craftsmen who restored it. And the story of a legal and legislative battle that changed how Pennsylvania protects its historic structures. On the 10th anniversary of the demolition and restoration, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission held a celebration at our property. Hundreds of people attended, including state officials, preservationists, and members of the community. A time capsule was placed in the root cellar containing documents and artifacts related to both Herman's original construction and the battle to save the structure. I gave another speech that day, older and hopefully wiser than I had been a decade earlier. 10 years ago, I watched an excavator tear into my family's root cellar, and I felt helpless. Today, I stand before you knowing that this structure is protected forever, celebrated and studied, serving as an example of what we can accomplish when we value heritage over convenience. Herman Oakes built this cellar with his hands and his skill. We saved it with determination and principle, and future generations will benefit from both. The crowd applauded, and Emma, now 12 years old, stood beside me beaming with pride in her family's story. She had written an essay about the root cellar for school that had won a state history competition. She understood in a way that many adults don't, that the past and present are connected, that history is not something dead and dusty but alive and relevant. As the celebration continued, I found myself standing alone for a moment at the root cellar entrance, looking at the bronze plaque that marked it as a protected landmark. Patricia Whitmore had tried to demolish this place for being out of compliance with HOA codes. Instead, she had ensured its immortality. The state of Pennsylvania would protect this structure long after every house in Meadowbrook Estates had crumbled. The irony was perfect and deeply satisfying. I thought about the journey from that horrible day when I came home to find the excavator in my yard to this moment of celebration and protection. The stress, the legal battles, the media attention, the criminal trials, the restoration, the documentary, the legislation. It had been overwhelming at times, but it had also been meaningful in ways I never could have anticipated. Herman Oakes built a root cellar that lasted over 130 years. I helped ensure it would last at least 130 more. That felt like a worthy legacy, a fulfillment of the responsibility we have to honor those who came before us and protect what they built for those who come after. As the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills that evening, casting long shadows across the restored root cellar, I felt a profound sense of peace. The battle was over, the structure was safe, and the lessons had been learned. Patricia's attempt to abuse her authority had been checked. The HOA had been reformed. The state's preservation laws had been strengthened, and my family's heritage had been secured for generations to come. The root cellar stood exactly as Herman had intended, a testament to craftsmanship and care, to building things that matter, to creating something that lasts. And now it stood as something more, a symbol of the importance of fighting for what's right, of protecting history against those who would carelessly destroy it, of understanding that we are merely temporary stewards of a heritage that belongs to all of us. In the end, Patricia Whitmore's biggest mistake wasn't demolishing my root cellar, it was underestimating how far I would go to protect it. She thought HOA bylaws trumped everything. She learned that history, heritage, and basic human decency matter more than her petty rules. She paid a heavy price for that lesson, but perhaps somewhere, somehow, she learned from it. I like to think so, though I'll never really know. What I do know is that the root cellar stands, protected and celebrated, exactly as it should be. And that's enough.